Okay, so we're going to talk about some of the basic processes of gathering audio so that you can do audio-related journalism stories. And we're going to have a total of four projects. Well, actually, depending on how you count it, maybe more than that. But actually, about four projects that are going to involve audio. And the main ones that we're concerned with right now immediately are the Faces of BG interview, which we've talked about in class, and then also the audio story. You're also going to have audio on the slideshow story, which we will talk about later. But anyway, as I said, I just want to talk about some basic processes here and things that you do when you're gathering audio for journalistic stories. So I'm going to start by talking about basic audio elements. So these are more or less the different types of audio things that you could put in a story. And the first of these is reporter voice or narration. And once again, I have to make clear that on these first two audio projects, and also when we do the slideshow project, your voice should not be on these projects. So the two audio stories that we're going to be doing, and then also when we get into doing the slideshow project, your voice should not be on these recordings. What I want you to do is basically tell the story using some of the other elements that we're going to be talking about. But again, one of the elements that we could use in a story would be reporter voice. And when we get later in the semester, we are going to do a video project that has your voice on it. But once again, do not put your voice on either of these first two audio projects or the slideshow project, which is coming down the pike. So the second audio element we have, and this is going to be very important and in fact critical to your audio projects, are interviews with subjects. And so generally speaking, what we do is we interview people, we record it, and then what we're looking for are basically little snippets of sound of interesting things that the person says. And we call those sound bites. And so we are basically going to use sound bites from people as a way to tell our story. And once again, since your voice isn't going to be on these stories, we need the people to talk more. And we need them to basically talk in a way that is actually going to help tell the story. The third element we have is what's called natural sound. And natural sound is essentially the sound that happens naturally wherever you are. And so, for example, if you go to the tractor pool that they have here in Bowling Green at the beginning of fall semester, I'm sure you've all gone to it. But, obviously you would have natural sound of the tractors, of the crowd cheering, stuff like that. And one of the things you want to do as a good audio journalist is you always want to make sure you record that natural sound. And you're not going to need natural sound for your first project, the Faces of BG project, but you will need it for the second. And, once again, what natural sound does is it's very important for providing ambiance. So when you have natural sound in the background of a story, it really helps set the scene for the story, and it really makes the listener feel like they're actually there and part of whatever the story is. And if you especially listen to NPR News does a great job of using natural sound in their stories. And a couple of the example links that I will share with you coming up here, you can hear that. And so, again, natural sound can provide us ambiance. It can also provide what I call substantive content. And what that means is sometimes the most interesting stuff that people say happens when you're not asking them a question. So, you are going to want to sit down and you're going to want to interview people. I guess you don't have to sit down, but you are going to want to interview people. But then you're also going to want to be on the lookout for people talking and saying things and interacting with each other when you're not asking them questions. So, for example, if you go to the tractor pull, you could get the natural sound of the tractors, the crowd cheering. But then you might also get some sound of maybe like one of the tractor drivers is talking to his mechanic, and they're kind of talking about, how fast he thinks he can go, or, maybe some kind of problem they're having with the tractor. And, you can record that. And in a lot of cases, that can actually provide some substantive content that will actually help make the story good. So natural sound is hugely important, and you're going to want to make sure you get natural sound, as I said, especially with the audio project and then coming up with the slideshow project. Once again, you don't need natural sound for the Faces of BG project. So other elements that we can have, but we're not really going to apply in this class, are going to be music. And this basically, I put this non-nat in parentheses. A lot of times you go someplace and there's music playing in the background. And, you might use some of that music playing. I'm sort of not counting that here. This would be where you would actually, take a track and you would actually lay it in the background of a story. And you kind of have to be careful about this. And you really, as I said, you don't want to use music in this class, but I sort of just want you to be aware of the option. Music is something that can be overused and really kind of becomes a lazy way of telling the story rather than having the people tell it. So you really only want to use it in specific situations, and you also have to beware of licensing issues. In other words, you're not allowed to actually just take a song clip and use it in a story without actually getting permission, and in some cases actually having to pay royalties in order to be able to do that. Okay, so let's talk about some story types. And these are essentially basic structures that you could use to put together an audio story. And the first story type is the traditional narrative story with a reporter. And once again, if you're following along with this, you can actually click some of these links and listen to some of these. But this is, again, a story that's going to have a reporter's voice on it. And the reporter is more or less going to tell most of the story. You're going to hear some sound bites, you're going to hear some natural sound, but the reporter is going to be telling the story. And once again, we're not really going to do a story like this in this class. This is the kind of stuff that we do in the broadcast journalism sequence. But once again, in this class, we're really not going to do narrative stories that have your voice on them. The other kind of story we can do is an interview. And I have an example here where they interviewed the White House social secretary. So what you can actually do is, sort of sit down with somebody and interview them, and then just make the entire interview be your story. And this might be something that you would do for a podcast, for example. And again, we're not really going to do this type of story in here, but, again, it is an option where you can, literally just sort of sit down with somebody and just sort of ask them questions back and forth, and then you just run that as your story. So the third kind of story, and this is now getting into the kinds of stories we're going to be doing in here, would be the profile story. And so this is going to be the kind of story where the subject tells the story. And I have an example here. I also have several other examples on Canvas and stuff that we've gone over in class. And, once again, what you're doing here is you're interviewing somebody, you're asking them questions, and then you're putting together their answers in a way where they tell the story. So that's a profile story, and once again, this is going to be very much like your first audio project, which is the Faces of BG project. Then we have the natural story, or the NAT story, and what the NAT story adds is natural sound. And so this is going to be like your second story, the audio story. So in this case, if you listen to a couple of these examples, and none of them are very long, but you're going to hear that these stories not only have interview sound bites in them, but they also have natural sound. So, for example, in the ones that are done in the BG newsroom, you will hear natural sound of the reporters and editors kind of talking to each other. In the guitar story, you will hear the guy actually playing guitar. And so what we're doing with a NAT story is we're adding the element of natural sound to it. And then the other thing we can do, and we're going to get into this later in the semester, we can also use audio for a slideshow accompaniment, which means we can be showing a series of slides and actually have an audio story running underneath as people watch those slides. And so once again, you can click on a couple of these links and listen to them. I think it's a really good idea to look at to listen to some of these, and to also look at some of the ones on Canvas. I think that they will give you some good ideas of stories that you could do for yourself. So then let's talk about equipment preparation. And, once again, this is going to be a little bit unpredictable because I don't know precisely what kind of device you're using, whether you're going to use a dedicated audio recorder or whether you're going to use your phone. And once again, if you use your phone, I don't know what software you're going to use, but these are sort of some general guidelines. So generally speaking, set your phone or your audio recorder for the highest possible recording quality. So if you go into settings somewhere, there is probably going to be a setting where it's going to say like low, medium, high, or something like that as far as recording quality. And what you're going to want to do is set it for the highest possible recording quality that's available. You also want to set it to mono if you have that capability. Mono basically means that it's just recording one channel of audio as opposed to stereo, where it would basically be recording two channels of the same thing, more or less. And just to keep it simple, we want to stick with mono, although it's not a huge deal if you end up recording something in stereo. We also want to be able to set our format preference. And so there are different kinds of audio file formats out there. And we're going to be using an audio editor called Audacity in this class. And it's a nice audio editor. It's free. It's pretty ubiquitous. A lot of people use it. But there are certain audio formats that it doesn't like. And so the best possible format is a WAV file. The second best format is MP3. The third best format is going to be either WMA, AIFF, or AAC. And these last two, AIFF and AAC, are probably going to be what you get if you use an Apple product. And so any one of these kind of formats needs to be converted. The good news is it's not all that hard to convert. There's actually a website that I furnished the link to called media.io, where you can actually upload any of these WMA, AIFF, or AAC files and then download them as waves. So again, though, if you have the ability to just record wave, right out of the box, that's great. So then we need to talk a little bit about the concept of compression. So some formats are compressed, which means that they have taken them and digitally manipulated them so that the files are not as big as the original files. So the most famous example of a compressed audio format obviously is MP3. And I'm sure you guys have lots of experience dealing with MP3s. And you probably know that, the size of an MP3 is like tiny compared to the original size of an audio file that comes off of a CD. So if you actually go buy a CD, and usually in class I've been just asking people, like by show of hands, like how many people actually purchase CDs. But if you do, go to the store and purchase a physical CD of somebody who has just come out with a new album. I don't know, like let's just say Lady Gaga for the purposes of our example. And if you listen to one of her songs, and let's say it's a 4-minute song, the size of the file on that disc is probably going to be something like 50 megabytes. But then if you take that same file and convert it to an MP3, it's going to be something more like 3 megabytes. And so MP3 is awesome because it makes audio files a lot smaller, which means we can play them faster on the web. It also means we can store them on our little devices. But the downside to MP3s is sometimes we lose some quality. And there are people who are audiophiles who basically say they can hear the difference between an MP3 and an actual uncompressed file. So anyway, just be aware that some formats, such as MP3, are compressed. Some are not compressed. So for example, WAV, AIFF, and WMA, all of those formats are not compressed. And so waves, incidentally, are the format that are actually on CDs that you buy in the store. So when you buy a CD at the store that's an actual Lady Gaga CD, the format of the files that are on that disc are actually waves. So I say here that it's best to gather and edit uncompressed and then save your finished piece as a compressed format. So the best, in a perfect world, what we would do is we would edit using an uncompressed format such as WAV or WMA, and then when we're done editing, we actually output or export the finished product as an MP3. The reason for that is sometimes when you go to edit MP3s, they sometimes don't edit quite as well as uncompressed formats. And it's probably not even something we're going to notice in this class at all. It kind of comes into play more if you're really trying to do advanced stuff. But once again, just sort of be aware of this concept that, the best thing to do is gather and edit with an uncompressed format and then save it as a compressed format when you're done editing it. So the basic process is going to go something like this. You have your audio recorder or your telephone, and basically what you're going to do is you're going to record your interviews, you're going to record your NAT sound, anything else that you need to do on the recorder. And then you actually plug the recorder or your phone into your computer. And what you're going to see when you do that is you're going to see a series of files. It might look something like this. And then what you're going to be able to do is actually transfer those files onto your computer, where we can then edit them using Audacity. And so this is a screenshot of the Audacity program, which we'll be getting into in class. And then when we're done editing in Audacity, we actually output it as an MP3 file. So in this particular case, we are calling our file myfinishedfile.mp3. And so we have finished editing it and we're done. We export it. And then what we're going to be able to do is add that MP3 file to our web page and also add it to our WordPress site. And the process of doing that is very straightforward and actually quite easy. So this is basically the overall process. So let's talk about some technical considerations. First of all, this is probably the most important thing that I can tell you. Make sure you get the mic or recorder as close as possible to the source. So that means when you're doing an interview, you want to have the recorder be like 10 to 12 inches away from the person's mouth who's talking. Okay? And again, since on most of these projects, your voice is not going to be the important thing, if you have to just set up the recorder so that it's always picking up the person you're interviewing more so than you, that's probably good. Because again, we don't need to hear you on any of these first couple of projects. So you do want to get the mic or recorder as close as possible to the source. Don't trust your ears. One of the things that people do, and I'll try to do a demo of this in class, but like if somebody is sitting like 10 feet away from me in this classroom and they talk to me, I can hear them perfectly fine, even though my right ear is starting to go. I can probably hear them pretty well. And so I might think, oh, okay, I'll just be able to hold my recorder like right here and stand 5 feet away from somebody and interview them. But when you do that, you're going to hear that you're barely going to be able to hear or understand what the person's saying. It's going to sound very hollow. It's going to have all this background noise in it. And the reason for that is the human ear and the human brain is kind of trained to pick out human voices and to sort of like ignore the noise and other background, whereas a recorder doesn't do that. So bottom line here is don't trust your ears. Get the recorder as close as possible to the source of the sound. You want to hold the recorder for the most part, but while you're holding it, don't scratch or bump it. So don't kind of be fidgeting around with it in your hand, because even though you can't really hear anything happening there, what's going to happen is the recorder's probably going to pick that up, and it's actually going to mess up your recording. So while you're holding the recorder, hold it still. Don't scratch it. Don't bump it. Another option is you can sometimes put the recorder on a desktop or a tabletop. So if you're talking to somebody across a table, you can maybe put your recorder on a tabletop. One of the things that I do when I do this, if I put a recorder on a tabletop, is I just prop it up a little bit. So essentially, you need to figure out like where the microphone is on your device, and then prop that part like up, maybe just like a half an inch. Like put a ruler under the recorder, or basically just put something that's like a half an inch wide, like under the recorder, to kind of prop it up to make it more pointing at the angle of the person's mouth rather than the base of the desktop. That way, in a lot of cases, you'll pick up less kind of hollow bouncing of echo sound from the desktop and more of the person talking. So you don't want to give the recorder to the person, generally speaking, because they are going to tend to fidget with it and sort of move it around a lot. And, again, it's better to not have them hold the recorder. And so keep that in mind. Some other things, make sure you do some test recordings before you actually go out and do your story. So before you actually go out and sit down and interview somebody, make a few test recordings with your device. Figure out how it works, figure out how well it picks up different kinds of sounds. Figure out where the microphone is on it. And so make sure that you know exactly where the microphone is, and which is basically what I'm saying here. So confirm and be aware of the actual location of the microphone on your device. With a telephone, it's probably going to be the speaking microphone. So essentially, when you hold the phone kind of up to your ear like a traditional phone, sort of the bottom front part, there's going to be like a little hole there that you're probably going to see, and chances are that's going to be the microphone. So if you're using a phone, put it in airplane mode. And what airplane mode will help you with is it will keep you from getting interruptions during your interview. So for example, if you're using your phone to record an interview and you have a text or something that comes through and it does the little beep, your phone is going to pick that up, and it's going to be in the interview, and it's going to be distracting, and it's going to be bad. So if you put your phone in airplane mode, that's going to make it so that it doesn't pick up any of those extraneous notifications or noises. Also, another huge thing is to beware of background noise. Now, sometimes we want background noise, and background noise, is going to sort of help tell that we're basically at the story. So, for example, if I'm at the tractor pool, I do want to hear the tractors in the background and the crowd like in the background. But the problem becomes if it gets too loud and we can't actually hear the people talking that we want to hear. And so you kind of have to sort of walk this balancing act between having some background noise but not having it be too loud. Similarly, you want to avoid distracting backgrounds or distracting environments. And, what I talk about here and the example, or I guess I should say the reason I bring this up, is that you want to have a background that has to do with the story. So, for example, if, while I'm listening to people doing their interviews and they're doing a story about the tractor pull and I'm hearing the tractors in the background, that's good, because they're at the tractor pull, that's the story. But if you're doing a story about, something else, and you go interview the person at the tractor pull, and the tractor pull has nothing to do with the story, like let's say that's actually where you go to interview the mayor to do a story about the new pipeline that's going through town. I don't want to hear the tractors in the background because that has nothing to do with the story. So that would be a distracting environment where, we're hearing this background noise and people are wondering, like, why am I hearing that? That doesn't really have anything to do with the story. And then finally, you want to use your headphones. So, once again, the one of the ways to be sure of what you're recording, or at least more sure of what you're recording, is to actually listen to it as you're recording it using your headphones. So, some basic interviewing tips. First of all, consider the end product. So think about what the story is that you're doing. Think about what is the structure of this story. Like, what is the point of the story? Like, how do you want the story to progress? And, again, consider your end product. So for the Faces of BG, what we're essentially looking for, sorry about this, get rid of that. What you're looking for is going to be essentially just interviewing somebody and having them tell their story. So, that's sort of how you kind of have to approach the story. So consider the end product. Talk to the person beforehand. You can kind of brief them about what you're doing, what you're looking for, but you don't want to talk to them too much, because in a lot of cases what can happen is if you talk to somebody too much, they end up like saying all the really good stuff before you start recording, which can be a bad thing. So record the entire interview in one clip. Don't start and stop it. So especially with your first project, you're going to basically just want to run that recorder for the 5 minutes or however long that you're going to be interviewing the person. Then what we do is later in the editing process, we're going to be able to like take out parts of that interview and just use the parts that we want to use. Have the person say their name and the thing you're interviewing them about. So this is a huge one, and especially with the kinds of stories we're going to be doing in here. Because remember, your voice isn't going to be on here to tell us like who we're listening to. And so it's a really good idea when you start out these stories to basically start them out by having the person say, for example, "My name is Jane Jones and I organize the BG Labor Day Parade." Like that would be the first line that you have in the story, because then that sort of sets the tone and basically sets the topic and tells us who's talking. So the first thing you should have somebody do is just to have them say their name and the thing that you're interviewing them about. And once again, that will kind of become then the first clip that you're going to use in the finished product that's going to help set the tone. So you should also go in with a plan. You should write questions out. And once again, you should sort of plan out those questions to hopefully get the best possible story that you can get. Avoid yes or no questions, especially with people who aren't used to being interviews. In a lot of cases, if you give somebody an opportunity to just say yes or no, they will just say yes or no. And generally speaking, we don't want that. We want them to say yes or no and then elaborate. One thing I've found it works pretty good for these kinds of stories is actually in some cases, rather than asking a question, just say, "Tell me about." So tell me about what it's like to organize the BG Labor Day Parade. Or tell me, what is it like to race one of these souped up tractors? And what I have found is in a lot of cases, what people will do when you say, "Tell me about," is they will kind of talk in more complete sentences, which is going to be good for our kinds of stories. So again, it's not that you don't ever want to ask a question, but just sort of think about adding this to your arsenal, the idea of just saying, "Tell me about," rather than actually asking a question. And here's this thing again. So stay quiet, nod if you have to, but you want to, if you're the kind of person who's like, puts in a lot of verbal cues when somebody else is talking, like going, yeah, 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 yeah. That can be distracting. So stay quiet. If you have to do some sort of reaction, nod. But once again, if we're kind of hearing you in the background as people are talking, that's going to get distracting. And then finally, get Nat. And so, as I said, you don't really need to do this for the first project, but you're definitely going to want to do it for the other projects. So when you're doing your story, you should be thinking about, okay, what are the Nat sound opportunities here? What are the different kinds of Nat sound that I can get that involve this story? And you're going to want to get that after you interview people. Okay, so that's a basic overview about gathering audio. And as I said, I encourage you to click some of the links that are actually here in this presentation and also some of the links that are on Canvas. All right, later.